Hello, my dear masterminds. They thought you were just watching. That's the assumption they settled on early, and it made them comfortable. People relax when they believe they're being observed but not processed. Observation feels passive to them. It feels harmless. They assume nothing is being stored, nothing is being aligned, nothing is being prepared. They confuse stillness with absence. So they spoke freely. They moved carelessly. They revealed sequences they thought were invisible. And all the while, you weren't focused on what they were saying in isolation. You were tracking how one thing led to another, how timing exposed intent, how small inconsistencies repeated across different moments. You weren't collecting details. You were connecting them quietly, patiently, without interrupting the flow. Most people watch events. Very few watch relationships between events. That's the difference they missed. While they were busy managing impressions, you were mapping structure. While they reacted to what was loud, you noticed what stayed consistent when nothing dramatic was happening. You saw how the same behaviors resurfaced under different conditions, how pressure revealed the same tendencies, how incentives produced the same shifts, and you never rushed to name it, because naming too early interrupts the pattern before it finishes forming. You let it breathe. You let it repeat. You let it confirm itself. They mistook that patience for passivity. They believed you were disengaged. But disengagement doesn't sharpen perception. Distance does. And you created distance not by withdrawing, but by refusing to interfere. That's what allowed the threads to appear. One conversation connected to another. One decision echoed in a later contradiction. One reaction explained a choice made months earlier. They thought you were quiet because you had nothing to add. The truth was you were waiting for the picture to complete itself. And once a picture completes, it doesn't need commentary. It needs precision. That's why you didn't ask many questions. Questions disrupt flow. You let people talk until they revealed how they think, not just what they think. You watched where they hesitated, what they defended, unprompted, what they rushed to explain. Those are the threads most people miss, because they're too busy performing inside the moment. You stayed outside the moment long enough to see how moments connect. And when someone connects threads instead of reacting to noise, the entire dynamic changes. Because patterns reveal consistency. Performances fluctuate. They assumed you were observing in real time, like everyone else. They didn't realize you were observing across time, linking past behavior to present posture, linking tone to outcome, linking silence to motive. That's why your stillness felt unfamiliar later. Not at first. At first it felt safe, familiar, easy to dismiss. But once they started noticing that your responses landed too accurately, that your timing felt deliberate, without being forced, something shifted. They couldn't figure out how you knew what you knew without being told. They didn't understand that you weren't reacting faster. You were concluding slower, and slower conclusions, when they're complete, are harder to dispute. You weren't guessing. You were integrating. That's what they failed to see. And by the time they sensed it, the threads were already connected. Once the threads connected, the room stopped behaving randomly around you. They didn't notice it at first, but the tone shifted. Conversations shortened, explanations became tighter. People began choosing their words with a level of care they didn't use before. Not because you demanded precision, but because precision became necessary. They could feel that loose talk no longer passed unnoticed. You weren't reacting, but you were registering. And registration without reaction is stabilizing. It removes the feedback people rely on to adjust their performance. Most social behavior depends on micro-responses, nods, interruptions, approval signals, discomfort cues. You gave none of those. So people kept revealing themselves longer than they meant to. They filled silence, thinking it needed to be filled. They over-explained, thinking clarity would protect them. They repeated patterns, believing repetition made them invisible. And every repetition added another thread. You watched how confidence faded under mild pressure, how certainty softened when timelines were questioned, how values shifted when incentives changed. You noticed who stayed consistent and who recalibrated themselves mid-sentence. Those recalibrations told you more than anything spoken directly. Because people don't maintain consistency smoothly when adjusting in real time. You weren't looking for contradiction. You were watching alignment. Alignment between words and behavior. Alignment between past claims and present decisions. Alignment between how someone moved when no one was watching versus when attention returned, and slowly. Without announcement, you stopped treating moments as isolated events. You treated them as evidence points in a larger structure. That's what made your presence feel heavier later. Not emotionally, structurally. People sensed that actions now had continuity, that nothing reset just because the conversation ended. They assumed observation was temporary. You proved perception could be cumulative, and cumulative perception changes how systems behave. They started checking themselves before acting, not because you warned them, but because something about your silence suggested memory. Not emotional memory, pattern memory, the kind that tracks sequence, that notices inconsistency, that doesn't need accusation to stay accurate. You weren't building a narrative about them, you were building a model. And once someone realizes they're being modeled instead of judged, their behavior shifts in lasting ways. Because judgment can be managed, models can't. That's when they started misreading their own discomfort. They thought it was pressure. They thought it was influence. It wasn't. It was exposure to continuity. Most people are comfortable being seen in fragments. A moment here, a performance there. They rely on resets. New days, new rooms, new audiences. You removed the reset without saying a word. You carried sequence forward. What they said last week still mattered. How they acted yesterday still informed today. And that quiet carryover altered the dynamic. They couldn't rely on improvisation the same way anymore. Improvisation depends on amnesia. You didn't forget. Not emotionally. Structurally. You remembered how things connect. You noticed when someone praised a value they'd abandoned earlier. When someone claimed certainty but avoided consequence. When someone positioned themselves as consistent while quietly adjusting to advantage. None of it required confrontation. Confrontation would have broken the pattern. You let it finish forming. And because you didn't interrupt, people exposed their own through lines. They revealed what repeats when no one stops them. That's the thread most observers never see. They watch what's said. You watched what persists. Over time, that persistence became obvious even to them. They couldn't explain why your responses felt accurate without being aggressive. Why your silence felt informative without being judgmental. Why outcomes around you resolved faster, cleaner, with less drama. It wasn't because you controlled anything. It was because you waited until control was unnecessary. When someone connects invisible threads, they don't need to push. The structure resolves naturally. And once that happens, people don't argue with conclusions. They adjust to them. The realization didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as recognition. They began to see that you were never behind the conversation. You were outside it. While they focused on winning moments, you were watching trajectories. While they reacted to tone, you tracked consequence. They mistook engagement for intelligence, and missed the intelligence that doesn't engage until it's finished mapping. You weren't slow to respond. You were refusing to respond to incomplete data. That's what separated you. Most people act to influence perception. You waited until perception stopped mattering. And once perception loses importance, influence fades with it. They noticed that when you finally spoke, nothing needed correction afterward. No backtracking, no clarification, no cleanup. The words landed and held, because they were attached to the structure, not the moment. People started to realize that you weren't processing what was happening. You were processing why it consistently happened this way. That depth affected them more than any open disagreement ever could. Open disagreement invites defense. Depth invites silence. They stopped trying to read your reactions and started watching their own behavior instead, because they could feel something was being seen, even if it wasn't being named. And once that feeling settles in a room, it rarely leaves. What finally clicked for them was simple, and it arrived after clarity had already formed. You weren't withholding response to appear composed. You weren't staying quiet to gain advantage. You genuinely didn't need to intervene early, because intervention wasn't where your influence lived. Your influence was in synthesis, in letting enough data accumulate that the outcome became obvious without force. They began to understand that while they were busy reacting to each other, you were watching how reactions stack, how one choice narrows the next, how pressure reveals default settings, how people repeat themselves when they think no one is tracking the sequence. You didn't interrupt, because interruption would have protected them. It would have allowed correction, adjustment, narrative repair. You let continuity do the work. That's why when you finally acted, it didn't feel aggressive. It felt complete, not dramatic, settled, like something reaching its natural conclusion. They realized then that observation was never the point. Connection was. You weren't watching people. You were watching systems move through people. And systems don't respond to emotion. They respond to structure. You let the structure expose itself fully before touching it. That's why nothing unraveled afterward. No backlash, no chaos, no need to explain. The threads were already connected. All you did was acknowledge what was already true. And once truth is acknowledged at the structural level, debate loses relevance. They believed you were observing. They didn't see that you were quietly assembling the entire picture. And by the time they noticed, the picture was complete. After that, the environment recalibrated, without instruction. People didn't announce awareness. They adjusted posture, timing, risk. They spoke with less excess and acted with fewer assumptions. Not because you demanded clarity, but because clarity became evident. They realized that someone in the room wasn't responding to appearances anymore. Someone was tracking coherence. When coherence is being tracked, shortcuts stop working. They couldn't rely on charm to blur gaps. They couldn't rely on urgency to force decisions. They couldn't rely on volume to mask inconsistency. You didn't remove their options. You revealed which options lacked substance. And that realization changed behavior faster than confrontation ever could. Silence around you became deliberate. Not awkward, deliberate. Because they understood that silence wasn't a pause, it was processing. And processing at that depth makes noise feel reckless. They learned that every move now had continuity, that what they did today would still matter tomorrow. That sequence wasn't resetting. Once people feel sequence is being preserved, they stop improvising. They start choosing. That's the shift they felt and couldn't name. You weren't observing to judge. You were connecting to understand. And understanding, when complete, doesn't need speed. It needs alignment. That alignment is what made you unreadable to them in the end, not mysterious. Unreadable, in the sense that their usual instruments stopped working. They tried to anticipate reactions and found none. They tried to provoke response and met silence that held steady. They tried to rush resolution and discovered the system no longer accelerated on command, because you weren't operating on their timeline. You were operating on certainty. When someone connects invisible threads long enough, outcomes stop being options. They become conclusions. That's what people felt when dealing with you. Not resistance, resolution. The sense that whatever move came next had already been accounted for. That awareness softened urgency without inviting submission. It didn't inspire fear. It inspired restraint. People realized that reacting quickly around you was disadvantageous. That half-formed strategies dissolved the moment they touched a structure you could already see through. So they slowed. They measured. They hesitated. And in that hesitation, they revealed even more, because hesitation exposes priority. It shows what someone is reluctant to commit to. You didn't need to extract that information. It surfaced on its own. The invisible threads you connected weren't secret. They were just ignored by people too busy performing to notice them. You noticed because you weren't performing at all. By the time they understood this, their assumed edge had already faded. They realized that awareness doesn't announce itself when it's working correctly. It waits. It lets motion expose motive. It lets repetition reveal intent. They had assumed you were collecting impressions the way everyone else does. They didn't see that you were assembling relationships between events. You weren't interested in isolated moments, because isolated moments mislead. People can perform once. They can improvise twice. They can even sustain a persona for a while. But they cannot maintain continuity. And continuity is where invisible threads become visible. You watched how one decision quietly constrained the next, how one excuse became the foundation for another, how confidence thinned when the same question appeared twice. None of this required attention from you. It required restraint, and restraint, when applied long enough, turns noise into signal. That's why your silence began to feel heavier over time. Not because it was threatening, but because it was unresolved. They could feel something forming without knowing what. And humans are uncomfortable when outcomes haven't declared themselves yet. You let that discomfort mature. You didn't rush to end it, because rushing would have protected them from seeing what they were building themselves. You let the system speak until it had nothing left to hide. That's when attempts to steer the situation quietly faded. Guidance relies on predictability. They had none with you, not because you were chaotic, but because you were complete. You didn't adjust your behavior to reactions. You didn't speed up when pressure increased. You didn't slow down when attention faded. You stayed anchored to the same internal sequence, and that consistency made external strategy ineffective. They realized that anything they tried next would simply reveal more about them than about you. Every move became revealing. Every adjustment exposed intent. And once that realization set in, effort felt wasteful. People conserve energy when they sense certainty. They stop pushing and start accommodating. That's what happened around you. Not submission, recognition. Recognition that someone in the room was no longer playing inside the moment but seeing through it. You weren't ahead of them by speed. You were ahead by position. You weren't looking at the board. You were looking at the structure the board sits on. And when someone operates from that level, reactions lose relevance. The system adjusts quietly, on its own. And that's where it ends. Without ceremony or resistance. Not because you imposed authority, but because the system finished revealing itself. They finally understood that you weren't waiting for the right moment to react. You were waiting for the moment when reaction wouldn't be necessary at all. Everything you needed to know had already surfaced through sequence, repetition, and alignment. The invisible threads weren't hidden. They were simply ignored by those who confuse motion with progress. You connected them because you refused to interfere while they were forming. And once connected, there was no need for further debate, no explanation to offer. People adjusted, because adjustment was the most reasonable response left. You didn't need their agreement. You didn't need acknowledgement. The outcome spoke quietly, and quiet outcomes tend to last. They believed you were observing because that's the highest level they knew how to name. They didn't realize you were integrating, and integration reshapes perspective without announcing itself. That's the final position. Not power that demands recognition, but awareness that makes recognition unnecessary. They now move differently, think differently, hesitate differently, long after the moment has passed, because someone once sat still long enough to see how everything connects. And once that's seen clearly, perception itself adjusts. What stays isn't the memory of you sitting quietly. It's the correction they carry forward. They don't rush conversations the same way anymore. They don't assume silence means lack of awareness. They don't mistake stillness for delay, something recalibrated in how they read situations, and that calibration stays active. They learned that the most consequential intelligence doesn't interrupt. It observes long enough for reality to expose its own seams. From that point on, they hesitate before filling gaps. They pause before over-explaining. They watch patterns a little longer instead of reacting to the first signal. Not because they're trying to imitate you, but because they felt the cost of not doing so. You didn't leave them with a story. You left them with a constraint, a quiet limit on how reckless interpretation can be. And that's why this endures over time. It doesn't need you present to keep working. It lives in behavior now, in restraint, in timing, in the awareness that someone once connected invisible threads, simply by refusing to interfere. The most decisive influence doesn't compete for attention. It waits for structure to finish revealing itself. You didn't teach that rule. You embodied it. You didn't win an argument. You removed the need for one. You didn't dominate a moment. You allowed the moment to expose its own logic. And once people experience that level of clarity, they can't unlearn it. They carry it into other rooms, other situations, other decisions. Silence feels different now. By the time they saw it, there was nothing left to question. Everything had already settled. And what settled didn't fade. It became the quiet rule they operate by now.